Think of the city you know best. It might be the one you were born in, or the one you moved to, or simply the one whose skyline you have seen so many times it has become part of how you understand the world. Think of its streets in the early morning, before most people are awake, the particular quality of light on the buildings, the sound of the first traffic, the smell of the air carrying something that is specific to that place and no other. Think of how it feels to move through it. The density of it. The sense that you are surrounded, at every moment, by the lives of thousands of people you will never know. Now try to imagine none of it existing. Not destroyed, never built. The land flat and open, the river running through it without bridges, the sky unbroken by anything made of stone or steel or glass. No streets, no markets, no temples, no districts, no neighborhoods. No word for any of it, because the thing itself does not yet exist. This is where we are going tonight. Back to the moment before the first city, when every human being on earth lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, knowing every person they would ever know by name and by face. Back to the moment when something changed. When, for reasons that archaeologists and historians and anthropologists are still arguing about, a group of human beings made a decision, or perhaps simply found themselves in a situation that no human beings had ever been in before. They stayed. Not for a season. Not for a year. Permanently. And in staying, they began without knowing it, without intending it, without any model to follow, to build something that would eventually become the defining human environment. The place where more than half of all people on earth now live. The place that produced writing, law, philosophy, architecture, trade, religion as we know it, politics as we know it, and virtually every other feature of what we call civilization. The city did not begin as an idea. It began as a problem. And the solution to that problem, worked out slowly and imperfectly over thousands of years by people who had no idea what they were building, is the world you live in now. Get comfortable. Let's begin. The oldest city in the world is not where most people expect it to be. It is not in Egypt, not in Greece, not in China. It is in what is now southern Iraq, in the flat, almost featureless alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region the ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The city is Uruk. At its peak, around 3000 BCE, Uruk was home to somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people, a number so large that no human settlement had ever come close to it before. The walls of Uruk, attributed by later tradition to the legendary king Gilgamesh, stretched for nearly 10 kilometers around the city. Inside those walls were temples, workshops, storage facilities, residential districts, and a bureaucratic apparatus complex enough to require the invention of writing to manage it. Uruk did not grow slowly from a village. It expanded with remarkable speed over a few centuries, drawing people in from the surrounding region in numbers that transformed the landscape. The world's first city was also, in a sense, the world's first metropolis, a place so large it operated by rules that had never existed before. Before Uruk, before any city, there was Göbekli Tepe. Discovered in southeastern Turkey in the 1990s and dated to approximately 9600 BC, more than 11,000 years ago, Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and human forms. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates every known city by thousands of years. And it required, by any reasonable estimate, the coordinated labor of hundreds of people working together over extended periods. This should not have been possible. The people who built it were, according to everything archaeologists previously believed, hunter-gatherers, mobile, small group societies incapable of sustained large-scale cooperation. Göbekli Tepe forced a complete revision of the sequence of human development. It suggested that large-scale organized cooperation, the essential precondition for cities, did not follow from agriculture and settlement. It may have preceded them. Humans may have gathered first, built something monumental, and then settled around it. The city may not have begun with surplus food. It may have begun with the need to gather for something that had no practical purpose at all. The standard account of how cities began runs roughly like this: humans learned to farm, farming produced surplus food allowed some people to stop farming and specialize in other things, specialization produced complexity produced cities. It is a clean, logical sequence. It is also increasingly contested. The evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe, and from the re-examination of early settlements across the Near East, suggests that the relationship between agriculture and urbanization was far messier, that people were gathering in large, semi-permanent settlements before reliable agriculture existed, and that agriculture may have developed in response to the demands of those gatherings rather than as their cause. The city, in this revised account, was not the product of agricultural surplus. It was the reason agriculture was intensified in the first place. People gathered for ceremony, for trade, for safety, for reasons that are still debated, and then had to figure out how to feed themselves in one place. The farm followed the city, not the other way around. The sequence that seems obvious, examined closely, runs backward. Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, was occupied continuously from approximately 7,500 BCE to 5,700 BCE, making it one of the earliest and largest known human settlements in the world, with a population at its peak of perhaps 8,000 people. It is remarkable for what it had and for what it conspicuously lacked. It had no streets. There were no roads, no paths between buildings, no public thoroughfares of any kind. The houses of Çatalhöyük were built directly against each other, sharing walls, forming a continuous mass of mud brick construction across the landscape. The only way to move through the settlement was across the rooftops. People entered their homes through holes in the roof, descending on wooden ladders into the interior. The dead were buried beneath the floors of the houses, under the living spaces of their families. There was no evidence of a central authority, no palace, no temple that dominated the site, no administrative center. Çatalhöyük was a city without a center, without streets, without hierarchy, a form of urban life so different from everything that followed that it barely fits the category. The first experiments in living together produced arrangements that have no modern equivalent. The invention of the brick, the small, standardized, stackable unit of construction that made large permanent buildings possible, is one of the most consequential technological developments in human history, and it happened quietly, without record, somewhere in the ancient Near East around 7000 BCE. The first bricks were not fired in kilns. They were simply mud mixed with straw, pressed into a mold, and dried in the sun. Sun-dried mud brick was the primary building material of Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, used for everything from the humblest house to the great ziggurats of Ur in Babylon. The standardization of the brick, the fact that every brick was essentially the same size and shape, was not merely a practical convenience. It was a cognitive achievement. It required thinking about construction in terms of interchangeable units, of systems of assembly, of a designed whole made from identical parts. The brick was the first mass-produced object in human history. Every building you have ever entered is, in some sense, a descendant of a handful of mud pressed into a wooden frame in ancient Mesopotamia and left in the sun to harden. The first known city planner in history is not a person but an idea, the grid. The city of Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan, was built around 2500 BCE on a strict grid plan, streets running at right angles, blocks of uniform size, buildings set back from the street in consistent patterns. Mohenjo-Daro was part of the Indus Valley Civilization, a culture that produced no deciphered writing, left no known royal inscriptions, built no monumental temples or palaces in the conventional sense, and is still largely mysterious. Yet the city it built was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinary in its regularity and its infrastructure. Every house had access to a drainage system. The drains ran beneath the streets, connected to larger channels that carried waste out of the city. Public wells were distributed throughout the residential areas. The planning was not incidental, it was the city's defining feature. Mohenjo-daro was designed. Someone, or some group of people, looked at an empty plain beside a river and decided in advance what the city would be. The grid, still the default form of urban planning in much of the world, is at least 4,500 years old. The cities of the ancient world were, by modern standards, extraordinarily dangerous places to live. Disease moved through dense urban populations with a speed and lethality that rural communities rarely experienced. Water sources were easily contaminated. Food stored in quantity attracted pests. The close proximity of humans and domesticated animals, which were kept inside cities and often inside houses, created conditions for the transmission of animal diseases to humans. Many of the infectious diseases that have shaped human history, smallpox, measles, influenza, are believed to have originated in or been dramatically amplified by the conditions of early urban life. Studies of skeletal remains from early cities consistently show higher rates of malnutrition, infection, and physical stress than contemporary rural populations. And yet people moved to cities anyway. They moved in enormous numbers, willingly, from healthier conditions into more dangerous ones. The city offered something that outweighed, in human calculation, the very real risk of dying there. Whatever that something was: opportunity, safety in numbers, the proximity of markets and temples and other people, it was powerful enough to override the evidence of the body. It still is. The ziggurat, the massive step temple tower that rose above every major city in ancient Mesopotamia, was not primarily a place of worship in the sense of a space where the public gathered to pray. It was the house of the god. The deity of the city lived in the temple at the top of the ziggurat, tended by priests, fed with offerings, clothed with fine textiles, consulted through divination. The god was, in a very practical sense, the landlord of the city. The agricultural land surrounding the city was understood to belong to the deity, administered by the temple on the god's behalf. The temple collected rents, managed irrigation, stored grain, organized labor, and distributed rations to workers and dependents. In the earliest Mesopotamian cities, the temple was not a religious institution separate from economic and political life. It was the economic and political institution, the center around which everything else organized. The first cities were, in their original conception, not human communities. They were divine estates. The humans lived and worked there at the pleasure of a god who needed feeding. The world's first known author is a woman. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the ruler who created the world's first empire in approximately 2334 BCE, and she served as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. She composed hymns to the goddess Inanna that survive on clay tablets, written in the first person, signed with her name. The poems are not merely liturgical formulas. They contain personal experience, emotional intensity, and a distinctive voice that is recognizably individual across 4,000 years. Enheduanna describes being driven from her position by a political enemy, wandering in exile, appealing to Inanna for restoration, and being restored. The world's first named author was writing from a city, about a city, in the context of urban political conflict. Literature, the first literature we can attach to a name, did not emerge from pastoral life or from solitary contemplation. It emerged from the complexity and conflict of urban existence. The city made literature necessary, because the city made experience complex enough to require it. The ancient city of Babylon, whose name has become synonymous with urban excess and corruption in Western tradition, was, at its height under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE, the largest city in the world, home to perhaps 200,000 people. Its walls, described by the Greek historian Herodotus, were said to be wide enough at the top for a four-horse chariot to turn around. The city was laid out on both sides of the Euphrates, connected by a bridge, one of the earliest known bridges over a major river. The Ishtar Gate, the northern entrance to the city, now reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, was faced with glazed blue brick decorated with alternating rows of lions, bulls, and dragons in vivid color. The city that the Hebrew Bible depicted as the epitome of godless human pride was, by the standards of its time, a masterpiece of urban planning, hydraulic engineering, and architectural ambition. The city that history remembers as corrupt was, to those who lived in it, simply the greatest city in the world. The reputation and the reality have always been different things. The first traffic regulations in recorded history appear in Julius Caesar's Rome, in 44 BC, the year of his assassination. Caesar issued an edict prohibiting wheeled vehicles from the streets of Rome during daylight hours, to address the gridlock that had made the city nearly impassable. The edict applied to all wheeled transport except for certain exempted vehicles, including the chariots of the Vestal Virgins. The result was that Roman nights were extraordinarily loud, the sound of iron wheels on stone pavement, the shouting of drivers, the protest of animals, in a city of perhaps 1 million people conducting its commercial transport in the dark. The poet Juvenal, writing in the 1st century CE, described sleep in Rome as impossible due to the noise of nighttime traffic. The problems of the modern city, congestion, noise, the conflict between movement and residence, were present in the world's first city of 1 million people. The solutions attempted were also recognizable. Rome's traffic problem was a modern problem in an ancient city. The city had already outgrown what anyone knew how to manage. The ancient city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, was designed from the beginning as an idea as much as a place. Alexander laid out the city's plan himself, or according to tradition, he did so using grain from the army's supplies when chalk was unavailable, scattering it on the ground to mark the lines of the future streets. The birds that descended to eat the grain were interpreted by the accompanying diviners as an omen of the city's future greatness, that it would feed the world. Alexandria was planned as a cosmopolitan city from its first moment, a place where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, and people from across the Mediterranean and the Near East would live and trade and think together. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, was not an accident of the city's growth. It was part of the original conception. Alexandria was built to be a city of the mind. The library was the city's purpose, made architectural. The Great Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single dramatic fire, as the popular account has it. It declined over centuries, through a combination of neglect, funding cuts, political disruption, and the gradual dispersal of its scholars to other cities. The famous fire, set by Julius Caesar's forces in 48 BCE during the siege of Alexandria, destroyed a warehouse of books near the harbor, not the library itself. The library continued to function for centuries after Caesar. What eventually ended it was not a catastrophe but an accumulation of smaller losses, the departure of scholars, the reduction of the royal patronage that funded it, the gradual shift of intellectual life to other centers. The world's greatest library was not burned. It faded. The loss of the Library of Alexandria is not a story about destruction. It is a story about what happens when a city stops believing that knowledge is worth the cost of preserving it. That story has no single dramatic moment. It happens slowly, in the margins of other events, and is only fully visible in retrospect. The ancient Roman city of Pompeii, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE and excavated beginning in the 18th century, has given historians something almost no other ancient city can offer, a frozen moment. The city stopped in the middle of an ordinary day. Bread was found still in the ovens. Election slogans were painted on walls, endorsements of candidates for local office, written in the handwriting of their supporters. Graffiti covered nearly every available surface, declarations of love, insults, advertisements, obscenities, philosophical observations, and the scores of gladiatorial contests. The graffiti of Pompeii is one of the most vivid records of ordinary urban life in the ancient world. One inscription, found on a wall near the Forum, reads simply, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not collapsed and fallen, since you must bear the tedious scribblings of so many writers." The city's walls were complaining about graffiti 2,000 years ago. The impulse to mark a surface, to leave evidence of presence in a public place, it was there in the first cities, and it has never left. The city of Teotihuacan, in the Valley of Mexico, was at its peak in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the 6th largest city in the world, home to perhaps 125,000 people at a time when most of Europe was organized in villages. Its main axis, the Avenue of the Dead, ran for more than 4 kilometers, lined with temples and platforms. The Pyramid of the Sun, built over a natural cave considered sacred, is one of the largest structures in the pre-Columbian Americas. And yet the identity of the people who built Teotihuacan remains almost entirely unknown. The city left no deciphered writing. No ruler's name has been confirmed. No royal tomb has been found. The city that dominated Mesoamerica for centuries, that influenced cultures from the Gulf Coast to the Maya lowlands, whose artistic style appears across hundreds of kilometers, the people who built it are nameless. Around 550 CE, something happened. The city's ceremonial core was deliberately burned, not by invaders, but apparently from within. Teotihuacan destroyed its own center and began to decline. The greatest city in the Americas at its time ended not with conquest but with an act of self-destruction whose reasons remain entirely unknown. The medieval Islamic city had a specific spatial logic that differed fundamentally from the grid-plan cities of the ancient world and the radial plans of many European cities. At the center was the Friday Mosque, the congregational mosque large enough to hold the entire male population of the city for the weekly communal prayer. Around the mosque was the covered market, the souk or bazaar, organized by trade, with the most prestigious and least odorous trades closest to the mosque and the noisiest and most pungent furthest away. Beyond the market were the residential quarters, mahallas, organized by religion, ethnicity, or trade, each a semi-autonomous neighborhood with its own mosque, bath, and bakery. The streets of the residential quarters were deliberately narrow and winding, not from poor planning but from deliberate design. The private was protected from the public by a labyrinthine street pattern that discouraged through traffic and preserved the quiet of domestic life. The medieval Islamic city was built on a specific theory of the relationship between public and private, sacred and commercial, a theory so coherent that it produced the same spatial pattern from Córdoba to Samarkand. The Black Death, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, moved along the trade routes that connected cities. It arrived in Europe through the port cities of Sicily and the Italian peninsula, carried by ships from the Black Sea. It spread along roads and rivers, from city to city, reaching inland populations through the same networks of commerce that had built urban prosperity. The cities that were most connected, the most economically vibrant, the most engaged in long-distance trade, were often the hardest hit. Florence lost perhaps half its population. Venice, at the center of Mediterranean commerce, was devastated repeatedly. The plague did not merely kill people. It transformed the relationship between city and countryside, between labor and capital, between the living and the dead, in ways that shaped the next 2 centuries of European history. The city, which had been the engine of medieval economic growth, became, briefly, the place most likely to kill you. And yet, within a generation, people returned. The city's pull was stronger than its danger. It always has been. The city of Venice was built on water, literally, on wooden piles driven into the mud of a lagoon, supporting platforms on which buildings were constructed, as an act of desperation. The people who founded it in the 5th and 6th centuries CE were refugees from the mainland, fleeing the successive invasions that were destroying the cities of the Roman Empire. They went where no invading army on horseback could follow, into the water. The island settlement that began as a refuge became, over the following centuries, one of the most powerful and wealthy cities in the world, the center of Mediterranean trade, the builder of the largest merchant fleet in Europe, the city that controlled the spice routes between east and west. Venice's extraordinary location, which had seemed a limitation, a compromise, a second choice, became its greatest strategic advantage. The city built on desperation became the city built on water, became the city that ruled the sea. The origin of one of the most beautiful cities ever built was fear. The word street derives from the Latin strata, meaning a paved or laid surface. The Romans were the first civilization to pave their urban streets systematically with stone, and the Roman road network, which eventually stretched for over 400,000 kilometers across the empire, was built on the same engineering principles as the streets of Rome itself. A Roman road was not simply a path. It was a layered construction, a foundation of large stones, layers of gravel and broken stone compacted above it, a surface of carefully fitted flat stones with a slight camber to shed water. Roman roads were built to last, and many of them did, remaining in use for over 1,000 years after the empire that built them had collapsed. The modern European road network still follows Roman alignments in many places. The streets of London, Paris, and dozens of other European cities are laid over Roman routes. Every time a city paves a street, it is performing an act that is at least 2,000 years old, in a tradition that has never been interrupted. The ancient city of Chang'an, now Xi'an in central China, was, at its height during the Tang dynasty in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, almost certainly the largest city in the world, with a population estimated at between 1 and 2 million people. It was also one of the most deliberately cosmopolitan. Chang'an was the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, and its population included Central Asians, Persians, Arabs, Indians, Koreans, Japanese, and people from across the known world. Foreign merchants had their own quarters. Foreign religions, Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, Manichaeism, were permitted to build their own temples and churches. The city's markets sold goods from across Asia and beyond. Tang poetry celebrates the music of Central Asian instruments, the dancing of Sogdian performers, the taste of wine from Fergana. The greatest city of the medieval world was not a monument to a single civilization. It was a place where civilizations met, traded, and mixed. The cosmopolitan city is not a modern invention. It is as old as the city itself. The first known building code in history appears in the Code of Hammurabi, compiled in Babylon around 1754 BCE. Several of its provisions deal specifically with construction. One states, if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Another provides, if it kills the son of the owner, the son of that builder shall be put to death. The logic that responsibility for a building's safety follows the builder through the consequences of failure is identical to the logic behind modern building codes and liability law. The specific punishment is not. What the Babylonian Code reveals is that the problems of urban construction, the conflict between the builder's interest in cutting costs and the occupant's interest in not being killed by their own ceiling, were recognized and legislated almost from the moment cities existed. The city created liability. The proximity of people and buildings created the need to assign responsibility for what those buildings did. Urban law began, in significant part, as construction regulation. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe, the stone city that gives the modern nation of Zimbabwe its name, stand in the interior of southern Africa and were built between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. At its peak in the 14th century, the city housed perhaps 18,000 people and was the center of a trading network that connected the gold-producing interior of Africa with the Swahili coast cities and through them to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. Great Zimbabwe was built entirely without mortar. The granite walls, some of them 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, were constructed by fitting stones together with extraordinary precision, relying entirely on gravity and the careful selection and shaping of stone. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they refused for decades to accept that they had been built by Africans, inventing elaborate theories of Phoenician or Arab construction. The archaeological evidence was unambiguous, and always had been. The city that became the center of an African trading empire was erased from the history of cities not by time but by a specific kind of disbelief. Some cities are forgotten. Others are deliberately not seen. The concept of the city as a distinct legal entity with its own rights, its own laws, its own capacity to own property and enter contracts developed in medieval Europe through the charter system. A city charter, granted by a king or a bishop, gave the inhabitants of a settlement a set of defined rights: the right to hold markets, to have their own courts, to elect their own officials, to tax themselves and control their own finances. The charter transformed a place into a person, a legal individual with standing in the courts, capable of being sued and of suing, capable of owning and being owned. The Latin phrase Stadtluft macht Fried, city air makes you free, reflected a specific legal reality in medieval Germany. A serf who lived in a chartered city for a year and a day became legally free, beyond the reach of their lord. The city was not merely a place. It was a legal status. To live in the city was to be a different kind of person under the law, freer, more mobile, more autonomous than those who lived outside its walls. The city invented a new category of human being, the citizen. Florence in the 14th and 15th centuries was, by the standards of its time, a medium-sized city with a population of perhaps 60,000 to 90,000 people at its peak before the Black Death. It was not the largest city in Italy, let alone in Europe. Yet the concentration of talent, wealth, and ambition that gathered in Florence during this period produced an outpouring of art, architecture, philosophy, and political thought that shaped Western civilization for the next 5 centuries. Brunelleschi's Dome, Ghiberti's Doors, Donatello's David, Botticelli's Primavera, Machiavelli's Prince. The concentration was not accidental. Florence had a specific economic and social structure dominated by merchant families whose wealth came from banking and textile production, who competed for status through patronage of the arts, who educated their sons in the humanist curriculum that recovered and reinterpreted classical antiquity. The city created the conditions. The conditions created the Renaissance. The greatest cultural flowering in Western history was not the achievement of exceptional individuals alone. It was what happened when exceptional individuals were placed in a specific kind of city, at a specific moment, with a specific set of incentives. The Great Fire of London in 1666 burned for 4 days, destroying approximately 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and most of the buildings of the medieval city. It began in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of September 2 and spread rapidly through the closely packed timber-framed buildings of the old city. The fire killed relatively few people directly. The official death toll was remarkably low, though historians debate whether many deaths went unrecorded. What it destroyed was a medieval city that had grown organically over centuries, without plan, without regulation, without any principle of organization beyond immediate need. What was built in its place was different: streets slightly wider, buildings of brick and stone rather than timber, a rebuilt city that still retained the basic street plan of its medieval predecessor but was materially transformed. Christopher Wren submitted a grand redesign, a rational, planned city of wide boulevards and elegant piazzas. It was rejected, partly for practical reasons and partly because the property owners of London refused to surrender their existing plots. The city that exists today in the City of London follows a medieval street plan, built over by fire and rebuilt in the 17th century, wearing the same skeleton it grew 2,000 years ago. The invention of the elevator transformed the city more fundamentally than almost any other single technology. Before the safety elevator, patented by Alicia Otis in 1852 and first used in a commercial building in New York in 1857, buildings rarely exceeded 5 or 6 stories, because the upper floors were considered the least desirable, the most effort to reach, the furthest from street life. The elevator inverted this logic entirely. The upper floors became the most desirable, the highest, the quietest, the furthest from the noise and smell of the street, with the best views. Real estate values in tall buildings now rise with altitude. The skyscraper, the defining architectural form of the 20th century city, was not made possible by steel frame construction alone. It was made possible by the willingness of people to go up. Otis's elevator did not merely solve a mechanical problem. It reorganized human behavior in vertical space, created new social hierarchies based on height, and made it possible to put 50,000 people on a single city block. The modern city is vertical because a man in the 1850s figured out how to make it safe to stop falling. The ancient city of Rome at its peak in the 2nd century CE had a population of perhaps 1 million people, a density that would not be seen again in a European city until London in the 19th century. To house this population, Rome developed a building type that would not reappear in Western cities for nearly 2,000 years, the multi-story apartment block. The Roman insula, literally, island, was a large residential building of 5 to 7 stories, housing dozens of families in individual apartments. The ground floor, with direct street access, was given to shops and the wealthiest tenants. Upper floors were progressively cheaper, smaller, and more dangerous, not only because of the effort of climbing but because they were more vulnerable to the fires that regularly swept through the city. Roman law eventually capped the height of insulae at 21 meters, approximately 7 stories, after a series of catastrophic collapses. The apartment building, the mixed-use street-level commercial ground floor, the premium on lower floors, these features of Roman urban housing disappeared from European cities after Rome's fall and had to be reinvented, slowly and imperfectly, over the following 18 centuries. The Haussmannization of Paris, the massive urban redevelopment program carried out under the direction of Baron George Eugene Haussmann between 1853 and 1870, at the order of Napoleon III, transformed the medieval city into the Paris that exists today. Haussmann demolished approximately 60% of the medieval city, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents, to build the wide boulevards, uniform facades, parks, sewers, and infrastructure that define modern Paris. The reasons were multiple and not all of them were aesthetic. The wide boulevards made it impossible to build the street barricades that Parisian revolutionaries had used effectively in 1830 and 1848. They were, in part, a military measure against popular uprising. The sewers and water supply reduced the cholera epidemics that had devastated the city. The uniform building heights and facades created the visual coherence that makes Paris instantly recognizable. The city that the world considers the most beautiful urban environment in Western history was created by an act of almost unprecedented destruction, the deliberate demolition of a living medieval city to build an idea of what a city should be. The concept of the suburb, residential areas on the edges of cities, separated from the commercial center, connected by transport, is not a 20th century invention. It is ancient. Roman cities had suburbs. The word itself derives from Latin suburbium, meaning below or outside the city. The suburbs of Roman cities were places of mixed character, market gardens, villas of the wealthy who wanted space and air, workshops too noisy or smelly for the city center, cemeteries, which Roman law required to be outside the city walls, and the settlements of the poor who could not afford city rents. The suburb was always, from the beginning, a place of ambiguity, neither fully urban nor fully rural, neither prestigious nor entirely marginal. The 20th century American suburb, with its single-family houses, its dependence on the automobile, its separation of residential from commercial life, is a specific historical form of something much older, the human tendency to want the city's opportunities without the city's density, to be near the center without being in it. The suburb is as old as the city. The desire to be almost there, but not quite, that is also ancient. The city of Pompeii had 41 known bakeries at the time of its destruction in 79 CE, serving a population of approximately 11,000 people. This ratio, roughly one bakery for every 270 people, is comparable to the ratio of bakeries to population in many modern European cities. Pompeii also had 89 known bars and taverns, a covered market, a forum, 2 theaters, an amphitheater, multiple bath complexes, and a sophisticated water distribution system fed by an aqueduct that served public fountains, baths, and private connections to wealthy homes. The ordinary infrastructure of urban life, the places where people ate, drank, bathed, shopped, were entertained, collected water, was already fully developed in a Roman city of 11,000 people 2,000 years ago. The human needs that cities exist to serve have not changed. The bakery on the corner, the bar at the end of the street, the public bath, the covered market, these were the city's necessities then as they are now. The forms have changed. The needs have not moved at all. The ancient city of Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, in what is now Tunisia, around 814 BC, grew to become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean, with a population of perhaps 700,000 at its peak and a commercial network that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the shores of the Black Sea. After 3 Punic wars with Rome, the city was captured, its population killed or enslaved, and the site razed. The Roman Senate had debated whether to destroy Carthage utterly. The phrase Carthago delende est, Carthage must be destroyed, was repeated so often by the senator Cato the Elder that it became famous. After its destruction in 146 BCE, the Romans later built a new city on the same site, Roman Carthage, which became one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire. The story of Carthage is the story of what cities mean to civilizations, that a city can be destroyed completely and yet the place where it stood remains so important that another city must be built there. Some locations demand cities. The land itself insists. The first known city to install gas street lighting was Baltimore, Maryland, in 1816, making it the first city in the Americas, and among the first in the world, to light its streets artificially at night on a systematic basis. London had installed gas lighting in parts of Westminster in 1812. The effect of reliable street lighting on urban life was profound and immediate. Cities that had largely shut down after dark, where movement at night was dangerous, where commerce ceased and most public life withdrew indoors, began to extend their active hours into the evening and then into the night. Shops stayed open later. Theaters multiplied. Cafes and restaurants became viable businesses in the evening hours. The night city, the city of electric light, of late commerce, of entertainment extending past midnight, began with gas lamps on Baltimore streets in 1816. The transformation of night from a time of danger and withdrawal to a time of commerce and entertainment is one of the least remarked and most consequential changes in urban history. The city conquered darkness, and in doing so, doubled the hours in which it could be itself. The ancient Athenian agora, the open public space at the heart of the city, surrounded by colonnaded buildings housing law courts, council chambers, and commercial stalls, was the birthplace of a specific kind of conversation that changed Western thought. Socrates conducted his philosophical dialogues in the agora, approaching strangers, asking them questions, pursuing the implications of their answers until the contradictions were exposed. The agora was not a lecture hall or a school. It was a public space where the full social mix of the city, citizens, foreigners, merchants, slaves, gathered for commerce and civic business. The dialogue that produced Western philosophy happened in the middle of a marketplace. The proximity of ideas and commerce, of the philosophical and the transactional, the agora held them together without separating them. When Socrates was put on trial and executed in 399 BCE, it was in the agora, the same place where he had conducted his life's work. The city that created philosophy also killed the philosopher. That too is a city's nature. The city of Baghdad was founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur as a planned capital built from scratch on a flat plain beside the Tigris River over a period of 4 years, by a workforce estimated at 100,000 laborers brought from across the Islamic world. Its original form was extraordinary, a perfect circle, approximately 2.5 kilometers in diameter, with 4 gates oriented to the cardinal directions, surrounded by a double wall and a moat. At the center was the Caliph's palace and the Friday mosque. Residential and commercial districts were arranged between the center and the outer wall. The circular city, called Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, was designed to express the cosmic centrality of the Caliph's power. Within a generation, Baghdad had burst beyond its walls and become a sprawling, organically growing city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city in the world outside of China. The perfect geometric plan was swallowed by the city's actual life almost immediately. The ideal city and the real city are always different things, and the real city always wins. The great Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, when Hulagu Khan's forces sacked the city, killed the last Abbasid caliph, and massacred the population, was described by contemporaries as one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. The Tigris ran black with ink from the books thrown into it from the city's libraries and red with blood from the dead, according to medieval accounts. The House of Wisdom, the great translation and research institution that had been the intellectual center of the Islamic world for centuries, was destroyed. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in Mesopotamia for thousands of years were wrecked and never fully restored. The population of Iraq declined dramatically and did not recover for centuries. What the Mongol sack of Baghdad destroyed was not only a city but an entire ecosystem of urban civilization, the libraries, the scholars, the agricultural infrastructure, the trade networks that had made Mesopotamia the most advanced region in the world. Some cities, when they fall, take centuries of accumulated human achievement with them into the silence. The first modern census, a systematic, universal count of an urban population for administrative purposes, was conducted in the city-state of Nuremberg in 1449. Before systematic census-taking, city governments operated on estimates, guesses, and the records of individual guilds and parishes. The census revealed something that city administrators had not previously known with certainty: exactly how many people they were governing, where they lived, and what they did. The knowledge of the city's own population was, from this point forward, a tool of governance. The counted city could be taxed more efficiently, conscripted more reliably, fed more rationally, administered with greater precision. The census did not merely record the city. It changed the relationship between the city and its inhabitants, making the individual legible to the state in a new way. The counted person was a different kind of subject than the uncounted one. The city that knows how many people it contains can do things that the city that merely guesses cannot. Knowledge of the city is itself a form of power over it. The city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, built on an island in the middle of a lake in the Valley of Mexico, had a population at its height in the early 16th century of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 people, making it one of the 5 largest cities in the world at the time and almost certainly the largest city in the Americas. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, his soldiers, veterans of European wars, men who had seen Seville, Madrid, and the cities of the Caribbean, were stunned. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier who was present, wrote that they did not know whether what they were seeing was real. The city was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, each wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland springs. The great market of Tlatelolco was larger than any market in Spain. The city that Cortés proceeded to destroy systematically and completely, over the ruins of which Mexico City was built, was, by the judgment of the men who destroyed it, magnificent. The invention of the postal system transformed cities from isolated nodes into connected networks. The first organized postal service in the Western world was established by the Roman Empire, the cursus publicus, a relay system of horse stations across the empire's roads, through which official communications could travel at remarkable speed. A message from Rome could reach the eastern frontier in a matter of days. The system was reserved for official use; private citizens could not use it. The first postal systems open to private correspondence appeared in the Italian city-states in the 15th century, particularly in Venice, which established regular courier services to other major cities for commercial correspondence. The postal system changed what a city was. It made the city not merely a place where people gathered physically, but a node in a network of information exchange. The merchant in Venice could know what was happening in Antwerp and Constantinople before the news reached most people in his own city. The city that was connected by post was a different kind of city from the one that was not. It was already becoming something like what cities are now. The concept of the public park, a space within the city set aside for nature, open to all residents regardless of class, is largely a 19th century invention. Before the 19th century, the green spaces within cities were almost invariably private: the gardens of palaces, the grounds of aristocratic houses, the enclosed spaces of religious institutions. The transformation of these spaces, or the creation of new ones, into public amenity was a deliberate social and political act. Central Park in New York, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux and built between 1858 and 1876, was explicitly designed to provide the urban poor with access to the restorative experience of nature that the wealthy could find on their private estates. Olmsted believed that exposure to natural beauty was psychologically and morally necessary for urban populations, and that the failure to provide it was a form of social injustice. The public park was not a convenience. It was a political statement about what the city owed its inhabitants. The green space in the city began as an argument about democracy. The first underground railway in the world opened in London on January 10, 1863, the Metropolitan Railway, running between Paddington and Farringdon Street, a distance of approximately 6 kilometers. The trains were steam-powered, and the tunnels filled rapidly with smoke, making the experience of riding them memorably unpleasant. Nevertheless, 38,000 people rode the line on its first day. The Underground Railway transformed the relationship between the city and its geography. Before the Underground, people lived close to where they worked, because walking was the primary mode of urban movement. The Underground made it possible to live further from the center and travel quickly to it, creating the pattern of residential periphery and commercial center that defines most large cities today. The commute, the daily movement of large numbers of people between home and work, is a product of the Underground Railway. The separation of where people live from where they work, which now seems natural, is approximately 160 years old. It was built not by a planner's vision but by the practical problem of moving people through a city that had grown too large to walk across. The medieval European city was organized around the guild, the association of craftsmen or merchants in a particular trade, which controlled entry into the trade, set standards of quality, regulated prices, and provided its members with mutual support in illness and death. The guilds were the city's economic skeleton. They were also its social structure, providing community, identity, and a framework of obligation that extended from the master down to the apprentice and back up again. The physical city reflected this organization. Streets were often named for the trades conducted on them: Bread Street, Milk Street, Ironmonger's Lane, Goldsmith's Row. The medieval city was legible in its streets. You could read the city's economy in its geography. The dissolution of the guild system, beginning in the 16th century and largely complete by the 19th, was one of the most significant social transformations in European urban history. It removed the framework of mutual obligation that had governed urban economic life for centuries, and replaced it with the labor market. The city became less legible and less secure at the same time. The first known urban water supply system, a network of clay pipes distributing water from a central source to multiple points throughout a settlement, was constructed in the ancient city of Knossos on Crete, around 1700 BCE. The Minoan civilization that built Knossos also constructed the palace's internal plumbing, terracotta pipes running through the walls, supplying water to bathrooms and draining waste away. This infrastructure was more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia, and would not be matched in Europe for nearly 3,000 years until the Roman aqueduct system. The human desire for clean running water is as old as the city itself. Every urban civilization in history has made water supply one of its first infrastructure priorities. And the failure of water supply has ended cities, through epidemic disease, through the inability to sustain population, through the simple fact that without water, no density of human settlement is possible. The city is, at its foundation, a hydraulic problem. The politics of water, who controls it, who distributes it, who profits from it, is among the oldest forms of urban power. The city of Babylon maintained a zoo, the first known zoological collection in the world, established by Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE. The zoo housed animals brought from across the empire and beyond: lions, bears, exotic birds, and creatures that no Babylonian had ever seen before they arrived in the city. The collection of exotic animals was an expression of imperial power, a demonstration that the city's reach extended to the furthest corners of the known world, that Babylon could command the animal kingdom as it commanded the human one. But it was also, unmistakably, a place where the urban population could see things they would never otherwise encounter. The zoo, the bringing of the wild into the city for the education and wonder of its inhabitants, began as an instrument of imperial display. It became, over time, something more ambiguous, a place where the city and the natural world confronted each other, where children stood before something that made the city feel, momentarily, small. The first city in history to reach a population of 1 million people was Rome, sometime in the 1st century BCE. The second city to reach the threshold was not in Europe. It was Beijing, during the Ming Dynasty, probably in the 15th century CE. The third was London, around 1800. The fourth was New York, around 1875. Today, there are more than 30 cities with populations exceeding 10 million. The pace of urbanization accelerated so rapidly in the 20th century that more people moved from rural to urban areas between 1950 and 2000 than in all of previous human history combined. In 2007, for the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population lived in cities. The species that spent 99% of its existence living in small mobile groups of fewer than 50 people has, in the span of roughly 10,000 years, and with the most dramatic acceleration happening in the last 2 centuries, become an overwhelmingly urban species. The city won. Not by force, not by mandate, but by offering something, consistently, across every culture and every era, that the alternative could not match. The ancient city of Ur, one of the great cities of Mesopotamia, birthplace, according to the Hebrew Bible, of the patriarch Abraham, was abandoned around 500 BC, after the Euphrates River changed its course and left the city without water access. The city did not fall to conquest. It was not burned or sacked. It simply became impossible to sustain when the river moved. The ruins of Ur, including the Great Ziggurat, which still stands, now lie in the Iraqi desert, far from any water source, a monument to the fragility of the relationship between cities and the natural systems that sustain them. Throughout history, cities have been abandoned not because of military defeat but because the ecological conditions that made them viable changed: rivers shifted, rainfall patterns altered, forests were cleared and soils exhausted, groundwater was depleted. The city that seemed permanent was always dependent on conditions it did not control. The ruins in the desert are not failures of civilization. They are records of what happens when the land withdraws its consent. The first city to use a system of numbered addresses assigning specific numbers to specific buildings on specific streets was not Paris or London but a small city in Austria. The house numbering system was introduced in the Habsburg Empire beginning in the 1750s, initially for military purposes. Conscription required the ability to locate specific individuals in specific buildings, and the existing system of describing a location by neighborhood and proximity to landmarks was inadequate for this purpose. The numbered address was, at its origin, a military tool, a way for the state to find its citizens. The system spread across Europe over the following century, adopted by cities for postal delivery, taxation, and police administration. The numbered address made the city legible to power in a new way: every building uniquely identified, every resident theoretically locatable. The familiar act of giving someone your address, so ordinary that it requires no thought, began as a way for a government to find men to draft into its army. The convenience of the modern address is inseparable from the surveillance that created it. The city of Timbuktu, now in Mali, in the southern Sahara, was, at its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, a city of approximately 100,000 people and one of the most important centers of Islamic scholarship in the world. Its three great mosques, Jingareber, Sankor, and Sidi Yahya, were also universities, housing tens of thousands of students and a library of manuscripts estimated at between 100,000 and 700,000 volumes. Timbuktu was the southern terminus of the trans-Saharan trade routes, and its wealth came from the exchange of gold and salt. It was also a city of books, a place where manuscripts were collected, copied, and traded as commodities of high value. The image of Timbuktu as a remote, inaccessible place, preserved in the English phrase "from here to Timbuktu" as a synonym for the unreachably distant, is the opposite of its medieval reality. It was one of the most connected cities in the world, connected by camel routes to North Africa and the Mediterranean, by the Niger River to the rest of West Africa, by trade in ideas as well as gold. The settlement house movement of the late 19th century, represented most famously by Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, established in 1889, was one of the first systematic attempts to address the social consequences of rapid urbanization. Hull House was established in one of Chicago's most densely populated immigrant neighborhoods, and its founders, educated, middle-class women who chose to live there rather than simply visit, provided kindergartens, adult education classes, a public kitchen, a gymnasium, a library, and meeting spaces for labor unions and political organizations. What Addams and her colleagues were recognizing was that the industrial city had produced forms of poverty, isolation, and disadvantage that were qualitatively new, not the poverty of rural communities, which had its own support systems, but the poverty of strangers in a vast, indifferent city, cut off from the networks of family and community that had previously provided security. The settlement house was an attempt to rebuild community in the city. It was also a recognition that the city, left to its own logic, could produce isolation as efficiently as it produced wealth. The ancient city of Petra, carved into the rose-red sandstone cliffs of what is now southern Jordan by the Nabatean people beginning around the 4th century BCE, was a city built entirely for trade. Petra sat at the intersection of the routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean, and the Nabateans grew wealthy by controlling and taxing the caravans that passed through. The city's famous facades, the treasury, the monastery, the royal tombs, are not buildings in the conventional sense. They are the carved faces of structures hollowed out of the living rock, homes, temples, and tombs cut directly into the cliff, using the stone of the mountain as their walls, their ceilings, their floors. Petra at its peak may have housed 20,000 people in a landscape that received almost no rain. Its water system, a network of channels, pipes, and cisterns cut into the rock, collected every drop of the rare rainfall and distributed it across the city. Petra existed because of water management, in a place where water management should have been impossible. The city was an act of engineering so complete that it looked like nature. The concept of zoning, the legal division of urban land into areas designated for specific uses, separating residential from commercial from industrial, was first formally implemented in New York City in 1916, in response to the construction of the Equitable Building in Lower Manhattan, which rose 40 stories without setbacks, casting a permanent shadow over the surrounding blocks and their property values. The zoning resolution was an attempt to manage the vertical growth that the elevator had made possible. It established the stepped, setback profile that became the characteristic form of the American skyscraper, each floor smaller than the one below, as the building rose, to allow light to reach the street. Zoning transformed the city from an organic growth, where uses mixed, where a bakery and a bedroom might share a building, into a planned landscape where different functions were deliberately separated. The consequences of this separation, the car dependency it produced, the death of mixed-use street life, the creation of vast single-use zones that are empty at night or on weekends, were not anticipated in 1916. They became apparent only when the city had been thoroughly reorganized around a principle that had seemed, in a specific historical moment, purely rational. The first skyscraper in the world, defined as a multi-story building with a steel frame that carries the structural load, rather than load-bearing masonry walls, was the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, completed in 1885. It was 10 stories tall. By 1913, the Woolworth Building in New York had reached 57 stories. By 1931, the Empire State Building reached 102. The vertical city expanded faster in 50 years than the horizontal city had expanded in 5,000. The speed of the transformation was made possible by the simultaneous development of steel frame construction, the elevator, electric lighting, the telephone, and the mechanical systems, heating, ventilation, plumbing, that made tall buildings habitable. No single technology made the skyscraper. It required all of them at once. The vertical city was the product of a specific historical moment when multiple technologies converged, each making the others more possible. That convergence happened in Chicago and New York in the 1880s. The cities that experienced it first were transformed so completely that the change became the model for every city in the world that aspired to modernity. The skyscraper is not an architectural form. It is a statement about ambition, made in steel and glass, at a specific moment in the life of a civilization. The ancient Greek concept of the polis, usually translated as city-state, was not primarily a geographic entity. It was a community of citizens defined by shared laws, shared gods, shared customs, and shared participation in governance. The polis was, in Aristotle's definition, the community that existed for the sake of the good life, not merely for survival, not merely for commerce, but for the full flourishing of human beings. A collection of people living in the same place was not yet a polis. A polis required a specific kind of shared life: the agora where citizens deliberated, the temples where they worshipped together, the gymnasium where they trained and competed, the theater where they experienced their myths as collective drama. The physical city was the container for the polis, but it was not the polis itself. The polis was what happened in the city when citizens were fully present to each other, when the shared life was actually shared. This distinction, between a city as a geographic fact and a city as a community of shared life, has never been resolved. Every debate about what cities are for is, at some level, the same debate that Aristotle was conducting in Athens in the 4th century BCE. The cities of the ancient Indus Valley Civilization, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dhalavira, and dozens of others, flourished from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They had sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and a script that has never been deciphered. They had no known palaces, no known temples of monumental scale, no royal burials of exceptional wealth, no evidence of a military class, and no images that can be confidently identified as rulers or gods. The Indus Valley cities were prosperous, organized, and remarkably egalitarian by the standards of contemporary civilizations, or at least, the archaeologists' evidence for hierarchy and coercion is strikingly absent compared to Egypt or Mesopotamia. Around 1900 BCE, the cities were abandoned, probably due to a combination of climate change and shifts in river courses. The civilization that built some of the most sophisticated cities of the ancient world left no deciphered writing, no identified rulers, and no clear account of its own end. Among the greatest urban civilizations in human history, one of the most prosperous left the quietest record. The rebuilding of Tokyo after the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which killed over 100,000 people and destroyed most of the city, was one of the most rapid urban reconstructions in history. The city was substantially rebuilt within a decade, largely following its pre-existing street plan, in a process that mixed deliberate planning with the organic reconstruction of individual property owners acting on their own. The rebuilding of Tokyo after the firebombing of 1945, which destroyed even more of the city, was similarly rapid and similarly mixed in its planning. The result is a city that has been almost entirely rebuilt twice in a century, and that yet retains a spatial logic and neighborhood structure that predates both destructions. Cities, it seems, carry their own patterns in the memory of their inhabitants, in the property boundaries, the street alignments, the neighborhood identities that survived even catastrophic physical destruction and reassert themselves in the reconstruction. The city is not only in its buildings. It is in the knowledge its people carry of where things are, where things have always been, and where they belong. The ancient city of Alexandria had a lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, that was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world and stood for approximately 1,500 years before being destroyed by earthquakes in the 14th century CE. At its height, it may have been over 100 meters tall, one of the tallest structures in the ancient world. Its purpose was entirely practical: to guide ships safely into the harbor of a city that had no natural landmarks visible from the sea. The lighthouse was, in this sense, the city reaching out beyond itself, projecting its presence across the water, making itself visible and navigable from a distance. The Pharos became so synonymous with the concept of a lighthouse that the word for lighthouse in many languages, Faro in Spanish and Italian, Phare in French, derives directly from it. The structure is gone. The harbor it guided ships into is now largely underwater, the ruins of Alexandria's ancient waterfront lying beneath the Mediterranean. The word remains, carried in dozens of languages, a ghost of a building that guided sailors home to a city that no longer exists in the form they knew. The city of Amsterdam was built on a foundation of wooden piles driven into the soft peat and clay of the Dutch delta, approximately 10 million piles, supporting the buildings of the medieval and early modern city. The wood does not rot as long as it remains submerged in water without oxygen. When the water table drops, the piles are exposed to air, begin to decay, and the buildings above them sink and tilt. The characteristic lean of Amsterdam's canal houses is not architectural style. It is structural subsidence, the slow settling of buildings onto decaying foundations. Amsterdam's urban managers spend substantial resources monitoring and managing groundwater levels to keep the piles submerged. The city's survival depends on a precise balance of hydraulic management that has been maintained, with varying degrees of success, for centuries. Amsterdam, like Venice, is a city in permanent negotiation with the water beneath it, a negotiation that began the moment the first pile was driven and has never ended. The city exists by permission of its own infrastructure. Remove the piles, and there is nothing. The first urban police force in the modern sense, a professional, uniformed, civilian organization specifically tasked with maintaining order in the city and preventing crime, rather than a military force or a night watch, was established in London in 1829, under the Home Secretary Robert Peel, whose name gave the officers their nickname, Peelers, later Bobbies. Before the Metropolitan Police, London's security was provided by a patchwork of parish constables, night watchmen, and military forces, systems that had changed little since the medieval period and were manifestly inadequate for a city of over 1 million people. The creation of the Metropolitan Police was deeply controversial. Critics argued that a professional police force was a form of government surveillance incompatible with English liberties, that it was a continental, specifically French, idea that had no place in a free society. The debate about the relationship between urban order and civil liberty that accompanied the founding of the Metropolitan Police in 1829 has never been resolved. It continues in every city in the world where police forces operate. The city requires order. The means of maintaining it have always been contested. The ancient Athenian practice of ostracism, by which the citizens of Athens could vote to exile any person from the city for 10 years, without charge, without trial, and without appeal, was used primarily against the most powerful and successful men of the city. The procedure required a minimum of 6,000 votes cast. The person with the most votes was exiled. There was no accusation, no defense, no verdict. A citizen could be exiled simply for being too prominent, too popular, too powerful, for making other citizens nervous. The ostracism was the city's mechanism for protecting itself from its own most successful members. It expressed a fundamental anxiety of the democratic city, that individual greatness threatened collective equality, that the city that produced great men might be destroyed by them. The word ostracism, from ostracan, the pottery shard on which citizens scratched the name of the person they wished to exile, has entered every European language as the term for social exclusion. The city invented the concept, and then exported it to every social group that has used it since. The relationship between cities and plagues has shaped urban history as profoundly as any war or political revolution. The plague of Athens in 430 to 426 BC, which killed perhaps a quarter of the city's population during the Peloponnesian War, is described by Thucydides in terms that emphasize not only the physical suffering but the social dissolution, the breakdown of law, of religious observance, of the mutual obligations that held the city together. The Black Death in the 14th century transformed European urban economics, labor relations, and religious life. Cholera in the 19th century drove the construction of modern urban sewer systems in London, Paris, Hamburg, and New York, cities that might not have built adequate sanitation without the pressure of epidemic. The city, by creating density, created the conditions for epidemic disease. Then, by creating the wealth and organizational capacity that only density could produce, it created the medical and engineering responses that brought epidemic disease under control. The city both caused the problem and produced the solution. This pattern, the city generating a crisis that only the city can resolve, repeats throughout urban history. The concept of the coffeehouse as a center of urban intellectual and commercial life emerged simultaneously in London, Paris, and Vienna in the 17th century, and transformed the social geography of those cities within a generation. London's first coffeehouse opened in 1652. By 1700, there were over 2,000 coffeehouses in the city. They were places where men of different classes and occupations could sit at the same table, read newspapers, conduct business, argue politics, and exchange information for the price of a cup of coffee. Lloyd's of London, now one of the world's largest insurance markets, began as a coffeehouse where ship captains, merchants, and underwriters gathered to exchange information about shipping. The London Stock Exchange began as a coffeehouse called Jonathan's. The Royal Society, the oldest and most prestigious scientific organization in the English-speaking world, held many of its early meetings in coffeehouses. The intellectual and commercial revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries were conducted, in significant part, in rooms smelling of coffee and tobacco, where the city's energy concentrated and recombined in forms that no one who entered those rooms had planned. The ancient city of Catalhoyuk had no evidence of violence in its first 1,000 years of occupation. Skeletal analysis of the population shows remarkably low rates of trauma injury, and no weapons, no arrowheads, no spear points, no blades designed for use against other humans have been found in its early levels. For a settlement of 8,000 people, this is extraordinary. It suggests that the earliest experiment in dense human living was not, in its initial phase, a violent one. Violence appears in the archaeological record of Catalhoyuk only in its later periods, after approximately 1,000 years of peaceful occupation. What changed is not clear. Population pressure, resource competition, the arrival of new people, the development of hierarchy, any of these might have introduced the violence that the early settlement apparently lacked. The first city began, it seems, as a genuine experiment in peaceful coexistence. That the experiment eventually produced conflict is perhaps not surprising. That it lasted as long as it did without it is. The city of Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, situated at an altitude of 3,650 meters in the Himalayan plateau, was, for centuries, one of the most deliberately inaccessible cities in the world. The Tibetan authorities restricted entry to foreigners, and the combination of altitude, geography, and political closure made it genuinely difficult to reach. European explorers made multiple attempts to enter the city in the 19th century, most of them unsuccessful. When they finally gained entry, what they found was a city organized entirely around religious life, the Potala Palace, the seat of the Dalai Lama, dominating the city from a hill above it, monasteries and temples filling the urban landscape, the life of the city structured around religious calendar, religious institutions, and religious authority. Lhasa was, in its original conception, not primarily a commercial or political city. It was a sacred city, a city whose reason for existing was the maintenance of a specific relationship between its human inhabitants and a specific understanding of the divine. The city as a religious project, rather than an economic or political one, had its most complete expression in a place that tried, for as long as it could, to remain unknown. The first urban renewal program in American history, the systematic demolition of existing urban neighborhoods to make way for planned redevelopment, began in New York in the 1930s under the direction of Robert Moses, and accelerated dramatically after World War II with the Federal Urban Renewal Program established by the Housing Act of 1949. Between 1949 and 1973, urban renewal displaced approximately 1 million families in the United States, the majority of them poor, and a disproportionate number of them black. The neighborhoods demolished were often vibrant, densely populated, economically functional communities. What replaced them was frequently less successful than what had been there before: public housing towers that isolated residents from street life and commerce, highways that cut through neighborhoods to serve suburban commuters, civic centers that were empty after business hours. The communities destroyed by urban renewal did not fail. They were destroyed. The city that produced the most ambitious urban planning in American history also produced some of its most consequential urban damage. The planner's vision and the residents' reality have rarely coincided. The ancient Romans had a specific term for the noise of the city, fragor, the crash or din of the city. Roman writers complained about urban noise with a specificity and a vehemence that sounds entirely modern. The poet Martial complained about the noise of schoolteachers beginning their lessons before dawn. The philosopher Seneca, in a letter written from an apartment above a bathhouse, catalogued the sounds that prevented him from thinking: the grunts of weightlifters, the slap of hands on skin during massage, the shouts of the sausage seller, the cake seller, the various tradesmen whose cries penetrated from the street. The urban soundscape, the layered, incessant, inescapable noise of thousands of people in proximity, was a feature of city life from the beginning, and was experienced as both invigorating and exhausting, as both the evidence of urban vitality and the price of urban density. The city that never sleeps and the city that never quiets are the same city. They always have been. The city of Kyoto, founded as the imperial capital of Japan in 794 CE and laid out on a Chinese-inspired grid plan modeled on the Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, remained the formal imperial capital of Japan for over 1,000 years, even as real political power migrated elsewhere. When Edo, modern Tokyo, became the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, Kyoto remained the imperial capital, the city of the emperor, while Edo was the city of the shogun. Kyoto was deliberately spared American strategic bombing during World War II, a decision attributed to the intervention of Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, who had visited the city before the war and argued for its cultural significance. Kyoto's architectural heritage, its temples, gardens, wooden townhouses, and traditional urban fabric survived the war while most other Japanese cities were destroyed. The city that exists today is the most complete surviving example of pre-modern Japanese urban life, preserved partly by its political geography and partly by the aesthetic judgment of a man who had walked its streets and found them too beautiful to burn. The ancient Mesopotamian city of Nippur, situated between the two great cities of Ur and Babylon, was never a political capital. It was never the seat of an empire. Yet it was continuously occupied for approximately 6,000 years, longer than almost any other city in human history. Its significance was religious. Nippur was the home of the Temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, and the city from which legitimate kingship in Mesopotamia was understood to derive. No king of Mesopotamia could claim full legitimacy without the blessing of Enlil's priests at Nippur. Rulers who controlled Nippur controlled something more important than a military asset: they controlled the symbolic authorization of power. Nippur survived invasions, the fall of empires, and radical changes in political geography because its religious significance made it untouchable to anyone who needed legitimacy. The city that had no army, no walls worth defending, no particular strategic location endured for 6 millennia because it held something that power could not afford to destroy. Some cities survived by being necessary to everyone who would otherwise destroy them. The industrial city of the 19th century, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Pittsburgh, Chicago represented a new kind of urban environment for which no previous city offered a model. The concentration of factories, the mass migration of rural workers, the construction of dense working-class housing around industrial facilities, the pollution of air and water, the absence of sanitation, green space, or any urban amenity, these conditions were not planned. They happened because industrial production created the economic logic, and nothing in the existing urban framework was prepared to manage it. Friedrich Engels, visiting Manchester in 1842, described the working-class districts with a precision and a horror that influenced everything he and Marx subsequently wrote. The industrial city was not merely a new size of city. It was a new kind of human environment, one that demonstrated, more vividly than any previous urban form, what happened when economic logic operated without any countervailing principle of human welfare. The reforms that followed, sanitation legislation, housing codes, factory acts, public parks, public education, were not inevitable. They were fought for, over decades, against the resistance of those who profited from the conditions that were killing people. The livable city was always, in part, a political achievement. The city of Samarkand, in what is now Uzbekistan, was conquered by Alexander the Great in 329 BCE, destroyed and rebuilt by the Mongols in the 13th century, and rebuilt again as the capital of Timur's empire in the 14th and 15th centuries into one of the most magnificent cities of the medieval world. The Registan, the central plaza of Timur's Samarkand, surrounded by three monumental madrasas faced with intricate glazed tile, was described by travelers from across the Islamic world and from Europe as among the most beautiful urban spaces on earth. Samarkand sat at the intersection of the Silk Road's east-west and north-south axes, and its wealth came from controlling the flow of silk, spices, and ideas between China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. The city that was destroyed by the Mongols and rebuilt became more magnificent than what had been destroyed. The city that sits at the intersection of routes does not stay destroyed for long. The trade finds another way to its center, or it builds one. The first city in history to install electric street lighting on a systematic basis was Cleveland, Ohio, in 1879, the same year that Thomas Edison demonstrated the incandescent light bulb. The arc lights installed in Cleveland's public square were not the Edison bulb but an earlier technology, brilliant, harsh, and expensive. Edison's incandescent system, installed in Lower Manhattan in 1882, was the first practical electric lighting network for urban use, and within a decade, electric lighting was spreading through the cities of the industrialized world. The transformation of the city at night by electric light was not merely a matter of safety or convenience. It was a transformation of urban experience. The night city became a different kind of space, brilliantly lit in its commercial centers, the displays of shop windows visible after dark, the theaters and restaurants extending their hours, the electric advertisement signs creating a new visual language of the urban night. The city of light was not a metaphor. It was an engineering project, and it changed what the city was. The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro had a building known to archaeologists as the Great Bath that is one of the earliest known examples of a public water structure in the world. The tank, approximately 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, was lined with carefully fitted brick and sealed with bitumen to make it watertight. Steps led down into it from each end. It was surrounded by a colonnade and associated rooms. Its precise purpose is unknown. It may have been used for ritual bathing, for civic ceremonies, for practical water storage, or for some combination of these functions. What it demonstrates is that the public gathering around water, the civic space organized around the management and ritual use of water, is among the oldest urban forms. The Roman bath, the Islamic hammam, the Japanese sento, the Victorian swimming bath, the tradition of the public bathing facility, where the city's inhabitants came together in a shared experience of water and cleanliness, is one of the oldest continuous threads in urban history. The bath was where the city was most fully itself. The concept of the neighborhood, the subdivision of the city into smaller units with their own identity, social life, and local institutions, appears in virtually every urban tradition in history. The Roman vicus, the Islamic mahalla, the Chinese fawn, the medieval European parish, the modern urban neighborhood, they differ in their legal status and their relationship to the larger city, but they share a common function, making the city's scale humanly manageable. The neighborhood is the part of the city that a person can know on foot, in which they can recognize faces and be recognized, in which the city is reduced to the scale of community. The city, left to its own logic, tends toward anonymity, the condition of living in proximity to thousands of people without knowing any of them. The neighborhood is the city's solution to this problem, the creation of a smaller, knowable world within the larger, unknowable one. Every city in history has generated neighborhoods, whether planned or not. The human need for a manageable social scale does not disappear in the city. It finds a way to create itself. The city of Detroit, founded as a French colonial outpost in 1701, incorporated as an American city in 1806, and by the mid-20th century the fourth largest city in the United States and the center of the global automobile industry, reached its peak population of approximately 1.85 million in 1950. By 2013, when the city filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, its population had declined to approximately 700,000. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned, houses, schools, churches, factories standing empty and slowly deteriorating in a city that had been built for twice as many people. Detroit's decline is the most dramatic example of urban depopulation in American history, but it is not unique. The processes that produced it, deindustrialization, white flight, suburban migration, the withdrawal of federal investment, affected dozens of American cities. The city that the automobile built was also, in significant measure, destroyed by the automobile as highways and suburban development drew population and commerce out of the urban center and into sprawl that the city could not follow. The city that built the technology that undermined the city. The ancient city of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, begun by Darius I around 518 BCE, was not designed as a place of daily urban life. It was a ritual city, used primarily for the celebration of the Persian New Year, when delegations from all the empire's subject peoples arrived bearing tribute. The reliefs carved on the staircases of the Great Apadana Hall show these delegations in procession: Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Indians, Scythians, Ethiopians, each group identifiable by their distinctive dress and offerings. Persepolis was a city whose purpose was to make visible, once a year, the extent and diversity of the empire. It was a stage for imperial self-representation, built on a platform above the plain so that it could be seen from a distance. When Alexander the Great burned it in 330 BCE, whether deliberately or accidentally is still debated, he was destroying not merely a city but a specific performance of imperial identity. The city as theater, as a machine for making power visible, as a space where the empire showed itself to itself, this is one of the oldest functions of the city, and one of the most enduring. The city of Singapore, founded as a British colonial trading post in 1819 by Stamford Raffles on a largely uninhabited island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, became, in the second half of the 20th century, one of the most remarkable urban transformations in history. In 1965, when Singapore was expelled from the Malaysian Federation and became an independent nation, it had no natural resources, a largely poor population, inadequate housing, and no obvious economic foundation. By 2000, it had become one of the wealthiest cities on earth, with one of the highest per capita incomes in the world, universal housing and public-built apartments, universal education, negligible unemployment, and a port that was one of the busiest in the world. The transformation was deliberately engineered by a government that treated the city as a design problem and its population as a resource to be developed, with a combination of authoritarian efficiency and genuine investment in human welfare that was unlike any other urban development model. Singapore demonstrates that a city can be built, essentially from nothing, within a generation. Whether what was built at the cost of the political freedoms sacrificed to build it was worth the trade is a question the city has never fully resolved. The ancient Roman city of Ostia, the port city of Rome, situated at the mouth of the Tiber, has given archaeologists something unusual, a well-preserved example of an ordinary Roman urban neighborhood. Unlike Pompeii, which was frozen in a single moment, Ostia was abandoned gradually and its buildings were quarried for building materials over centuries, leaving the lower portions of walls exposed but readable. What they reveal is a city of remarkable social mixture, apartment buildings housing multiple families of different economic levels, commercial premises on the ground floors, warehouses beside residences, workshops beside baths. The city is a place of social proximity where the wealthy and the poor, the shopkeeper and the sailor, the free and the enslaved lived and worked in immediate physical proximity, is one of the defining features of urban life that distinguishes it from the more segregated residential patterns of modern cities. The ancient city was a place of uncomfortable, productive, inescapable human mixing. The degree to which modern cities have retreated from this mixing, through zoning, through the economics of real estate, through the automobile, is the degree to which they have lost something that the city, in its original form, always had. The city of São Paulo in Brazil, founded as a Jesuit mission in 1554, a small colonial town through most of its history, grew from a population of approximately 65,000 in 1890 to over 22 million in its metropolitan area today, making it the largest city in the southern hemisphere and the fourth largest metropolitan area in the world. This growth, from provincial town to global megalopolis in 130 years, is the most rapid urban expansion in history. It was driven by waves of immigration, Italian, Japanese, Lebanese, German, Spanish, by the industrialization of Brazil in the mid-20th century, and by the massive migration from Brazil's rural northeast. The city that grew so fast has never fully caught up with itself, its infrastructure, its transit systems, its housing, its governance perpetually lagging behind its population. São Paulo is a city in a permanent state of becoming too large to be fully understood, too fast-growing to be fully planned, a place where the formal city and the informal city exist in permanent negotiation, where the favela and the skyscraper are neighbors. It is, in this sense, a more honest city than most, more visibly a city in process, a city that has not yet become what it is going to be. The city is the oldest ongoing human experiment. It began in the river plains of Mesopotamia, in the valleys of the Indus, in the highlands of Mexico, as an improvisation, a response to conditions that no one fully understood, a gathering that became a settlement that became something for which there was no word. It has been rebuilt after floods and fires and plagues and wars and the slow withdrawal of rivers from their banks. It has been planned by emperors and grown against the plans of emperors. It has produced everything that human beings call civilization: writing, law, mathematics, philosophy, architecture, music, commerce, medicine, literature, and it has produced poverty, disease, violence, exploitation, and pollution on a scale that no other form of human settlement has approached. It contains, at its best, more human possibility per square kilometer than any other environment the species has ever created. And people have moved to it, across every century and every culture, in numbers that have never stopped growing, walking, sailing, riding, flying toward the lights and the noise and the density and the difficulty and the opportunity of the city. Not because it was easy. Because it was alive. And because wherever humans have gathered in sufficient numbers, in sufficient proximity, with sufficient time, something has always happened that could not have happened anywhere else. The city is still happening. It has never stopped. Tonight you have traveled through 10,000 years of human gathering. You have stood at the edge of an empty plain beside the Euphrates, before the first city existed, and watched it begin with mud and water and the need to keep records of grain. You have walked the rooftops of Catalhoyuk, the only path through a city with no streets. You have entered Baghdad at the height of its circular perfection, before the city's own life overwhelmed its plan. You have stood in the market of Tenochtitlan, which Spanish soldiers described as a dream. Every city in tonight's journey was, at some point, impossible. A settlement on a lagoon. A city carved from a cliff in a desert. A circle of perfection built in 4 years from nothing. A trading capital on a sub-Saharan plateau. A city built on wooden piles in a swamp. Each of them required human beings to solve problems that had never been solved before, to organize cooperation at a scale that had never been attempted, to build something that had no precedent and no guarantee of survival. Most of them survived. Some of them outlasted the civilizations that built them. Some of them are still being lived in, their ancient street plans carrying the feet of millions of people who have no idea they are walking on the bones of something 10,000 years old. The city you know, the one whose skyline you carry in your mind, is part of this same unbroken experiment. Its streets follow alignments decided by people who are long gone. Its neighborhoods carry names whose origins have been forgotten. Its oldest buildings remember things that no living person witnessed. It has survived things that should have destroyed it. It will survive things that have not yet happened. And somewhere in it, tonight, a light is still on. Someone is still awake. The city, as it always has been, is still alive while you rest. Sleep well.